get started, kia ora koutou, and thank you for joining us this evening or morning, depending on where you are in the world, for this international speaker series with Monica Araya. Ko Charlie Keeling aho. I'm a senior advisor in the communications and engagement team at the Commission, and I'll shortly explain how the session will run today. But before I do that, I'm going to ask Sandra to lead us into the session with a karakia.
Thank you, Charlie. Whakataka te hao ki te uru, whakataka te hao ki te tonga, kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi ake ana te atākura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei Māori ora.
Kia ora, Sandra, thank you. So before we get started, it would be really great if you could please write your name and the organisation or community you represent into the chat box while I'm just taking us through how the session will run. And let us know where you're joining us from in the world. Since we can't see your faces, it's always good to know who we've got participating in these sessions. This is the 11th session in our International Speaker Series, and it's actually the final one of 2021 as well. And we're very, very privileged to have Monica join us today alongside Commissioners Dr. Judy Lawrence and Professor James Renwick, who will be leading this session for us today. Judy is a leading expert in Aotearoa on climate change adaptation with a specialisation in decision-making under uncertainty. She's also coordinating lead author for the IPCC 6th Assessment Report. James is a leading climate scientist with a strong national and international reputation, evidenced by appointments as lead author and coordinating lead author on 3 assessment reports of the IPCC. I will shortly hand over to James to introduce Monica properly for us, before we have a chance to hear from Monica directly. This will be followed by a short discussion between Monica, James and Judy, before you have the chance to get your questions answered in our audience Q&A. You should see a box at the bottom of the screen where you can type your questions throughout, and we might not have a chance to cover all of them in the session, but we'll try and get to as many as we can. And if you'd like to speak to each other or share your thoughts, please feel free to use the chat. It's always really good to see your conversations, and it can be a good space to share your thoughts and any resources. I just want you to know as well that we are recording this session, so if anyone was unable to make it, they can watch it on our website afterwards. So that's enough from me. I'm now going to hand over to James. Kia ora, James. Oh, James, you're on mute.
Yes, still putting myself on mute occasionally. Kia ora, Charlie, and kia ora koutou. Thanks everyone for coming into this webinar. This is one I've really been looking forward to. As you've already heard, we're very lucky today to be connecting with Monica Araya. She's a ClimateWorks Distinguished Fellow and a Drive Electric Campaign Advisor. She's a Special Advisor to the UN High-Level Champion for Climate Action for COP26. And she just has a really long list of leadership and advisory roles worldwide over the last 2 or 3 decades. She's guided mobility, climate and energy strategies across Latin America, the US and Europe. And she champions voices from the global south and aims to ensure that transportation systems create meaningful improvements for people's lives. And one slogan or line that Monica has that I really like is that she works towards a world without tailpipe. And that's a world I think we would all enjoy seeing. So enough from me. Welcome, Monica, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I've been so looking forward to being in this virtual space. Even though I'm not in New Zealand, I hope one day I'll be there. Before I get started, I wanted to share with you that because I come from a small country that thinks big, there is a lot of affinity in Costa Rica whenever we hear something about New Zealand, about 5 million people, small country with big ideas. So I think even though our countries are not necessarily working together on a lot of topics, at least not yet, there has always been this fascination with, at least I know it around the world, but in particular in my country. So thank you so much for this invitation. And the other thing I wanted to share with you before I get started, and I'll tell you in a second what I plan to do, is that even though you will hear me talk a lot about the internal combustion engine, how to get to a faster transition to zero emission transportation, a world without tailpipes. Now more than ever, we have to be able to anchor whatever conversation we're having in the bigger conversation. So I know that when it comes to climate change, there are so many other sectors, so many other imperatives. And I just want you to know that even though I'm gonna get very narrow at some point, I work with a lot of people, and I know that ultimately we need to, whatever we do, we need to connect it to both what is happening outside and also connected to what is happening inside in our countries, because we know that it's been very tough for people, especially because of the pandemic. So I just wanted to make sure that when I get too narrow, you don't get the impression that I have lost the sight of the bigger picture. So what would I like to do today? I want to do at least 3 things, given that this is a huge topic. And basically, I'm calling from New Zealand, from Scotland, because I am going to be part of COP26 here in Scotland. So clearly, I want to bring some elements of that. So first of all, I would like to share some news about what is happening in terms of the connection between transportation, decarbonization, and the COP, given that I'm here. Then I'd like to give you a very concrete idea of what we mean by the Drive Electric campaign, because it's not just cars, it's about acceleration of electrification in all segments. And it's a pretty audacious idea, bringing many partners. And then I also would like to share some insights from the ground. I've been working in Latin America. I've been working in the US, and in the last 3 years, I've been living in Amsterdam. So that doesn't cover the entire world. And I know that we have to think about Africa, and we have to think about obviously Asia and many other sub-regions. The point is that despite a lot of differences, I have also learned that there are some common threads and common things we can do. So I want to give you a flavor, for example, of things that have happened very recently in Latin America that may surprise you. So I hope it's going to be good news. So let's get started with this idea of how to put this puzzle together when it comes to climate and transportation, because as you probably know, when it comes to the Paris Agreement and the UN process that brings together all these countries, the key word there is what national governments do in their plans, right? It's about going faster to say net zero by 2050. And right now there is a very tense conversation because the bigger countries are not upgrading these plans, and that is a problem for the world. So one of the things that is very important for all of us working on this is to look for some light and to look for some places where we can do things when the whole climate agenda gets overwhelming. So this happened to me a few years back. I came to a point where I thought, well, yes, we have to work and think nationally. We have to make sure these national plans get their act together. And at the same time, it's very important that we make progress in the specific sectors. Some people will take agriculture, others will take, say, energy systems. The big idea that captured my imagination at some point was, why can't we do something so that we get rid of tailpipes? And it's a long story, but I had a lot of obsession with the tailpipe as a concept, right? Like, why do we have to live with that exhaust and think that's normal? So my point is that a few years back, I decided to start connecting to climate through zero emission transportation, electric mobility, transportation that was quieter, transportation that didn't use petrol and diesel, and transportation that could help us with this idea or aspiration or imperative even that we have to leave fossil fuels behind. So that opened a huge door for me, because then it allowed me to anchor myself with very specific initiatives, very specific people. And it doesn't mean that by committing yourself to acceleration in a particular sector, it doesn't mean that you're giving up the whole thing on national engagement. I actually think they complement each other. I don't want to give the impression that by accelerating something at a sectoral level, you give up the traditional and very important process that we have to get right in the context of the Paris Agreement. So why is it that this particular moment we're living in the run-up to COP is unusual for transportation, for road transportation in particular? It is unusual because normally in that very big space of climate negotiations, there are so many huge topics that specific sectors are not necessarily a political priority for the presidency of that COP, that conference of the parties. And for the first time at this COP, there is road transportation as a sectoral priority for the UK presidency. So that has been unusual. And they created something called the Zero Emission Vehicle Transition Council, which again is quite unusual. And then that also led to the idea of coming together on Transport Day at COP in Glasgow on the 10th of November, and a group of countries, cities, regions, fleet owners, investors, and other organizations that are very engaged in the space are going to say a few things to the world. I will have to wait until the 10th of November. So the point is that gives us a hook in the global conversation. And in terms of the temperature of the conversation, there has been a concept that is, achieving a net zero goal by 2050 is a concept that is part of the architecture that we have built in the UN, and yet it doesn't really work for us working on transportation, right? Like, if a company says to you it's going to be net zero by 2050, a car company, for example, what is that supposed to mean for us in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years? So very quickly we realized that when it came to road transportation, we had to develop a different story, a more urgent story, because it's one of the sectors that has the technologies that we need in order to go to, in order to go fossil free. Unlike aviation or shipping or other sectors like steel, when it comes to road transportation, we have a lot of options. So the point is that several of us working with the COP26 architecture, working with people in the space, started to say, well, it's important to have a sense of the breakthroughs that we will need in order to get to net zero as soon as possible, no later than 2050. What do we need to achieve in the next 10 years? What do we need to achieve in the next 7 years, 5 years? What do we need to do in the next 2 years? So that led to something called the Race to Zero breakthroughs that for the first time, in the UN context had an idea, gave you an idea. You can, if you want, I encourage you to Google that, UN Race to Zero breakthroughs, and it also covers other sectors. The point is that it organizes our discussion. It gives us a sense of, okay, if you are going to do transformation of road transportation, when do we stop selling diesel buses? If we have to get to zero emissions in transportation by 2050, and a bus lasts for 15 years, when do we have to sell the last bus that uses diesel? What about trucks? What about cars? What about motorcycles? So the point is that discussion was very productive because it allowed us to have, in the context of the UN, a certain discussion that rarely happens, you know, being very specific about a sector. And at the same time, it brought the insights from a campaign that is called Drive Electric. So this may sound perhaps overwhelming for some of you that don't work in the space or are not familiar with COP or are not familiar with Drive Electric. So I want to clarify, I want to bring it to one concrete point. The last year was very productive because we were able to agree with the vision of where we need to do, where we need to be by 2030 with buses, with passenger cars, vans, where we need to start saying, well, after that year in core markets, we will need to stop selling these technologies. And then we went segment by segment. It's very rare that you get that kind of agreement when you have so many partners. So that is something that is there, is in the air. And I want to make sure that when I tell you that on road transportation, there has been a very productive year, especially since we didn't have the COP, we had more years to plan. And at the same time, it's interesting and it's sad that we have this situation with the breakthroughs, with very productive discussions, technical discussions. And at the same time, we know that in terms of climate and in terms of this COP, the rest of, let's say, ecosystem is not very optimistic about what will happen in the next days in Glasgow. So it's, you know, it's been a very particular situation for us because we working on electrification of transportation, and given that we have some good news, we have to be very good at keeping that package of good news. We have to be able to celebrate the good things that are happening without coming across as a sector that is pretending that because of the good news on road transportation, this COP is going to be all fine. So there is a chance under which the COP doesn't work and there will be very good news in very specific sectors, and perhaps road transportation will be one of them. Or there is a scenario under which there is a breakthrough, there is a political breakthrough at COP, and then we have a relatively okay COP, and then we have, in addition to what national governments do, we have very specific things and homework to do at the level of sectors. So that is, you know, the first cluster. COP for the first time will have political space for road transportation, zero emissions, excuse me. It's very important, excuse me, that we very sorry, that we emphasize the word zero emissions, because as you can imagine, if we did not have climate change, if we did not have to build a society that leaves fossil fuels behind, meaning oil, gas, coal, you know, we would have time for incremental change. We would have time for cleaner buses, cleaner taxis, cleaner trucks, but we don't have time. We really don't have time. So one of the things that we need to mainstream in our conversation, and this is going to be the second point, is how do we design strategies, campaigns, initiatives that are very focused on getting to zero? And that is exactly what we are building through something we call the Drive Electric campaign, which in essence is a coalition of about 70 partners around the world. If you go to driveelectriccampaign.org, you will find a summary. Why is that an audacious idea? Well, it is about bringing together all the foundations, the philanthropic foundations that work on climate, which are pretty influential, especially in the US and Europe, because they fund a lot of the think tanks, they fund a lot of the activists, they fund a lot of the advocates in cities working and with others, with investors. And they never had anything around transportation that basically brought them together. So this idea is about making sure that there is an architecture that will support all the groups and initiatives and partners that are already working on the space across the world, and making sure that they get the resources they need. So the audacious idea of this campaign and coalition was to think pretty big for philanthropic purposes, knowing that we will need public and private capital in order to actually make this transition happen. The point about the campaign is to say what needs to happen in the next 5 years if we want to accelerate the electrification of transportation 20 years. What is the smart thing to do? How do you organize? How do you collaborate? How do you prioritize what you do in, for example, the car markets, say Europe, the US, especially California, China? How do you engage with emerging economies? And since you cannot do everything, how do you get started? And what do you do in the next 2 years? So this is at the core of what Drive Electric is doing. And what I found really surprising, having been with Drive Electric already for a year, is that once you start getting organized and you have this big idea, and in this case, the idea was to say, well, we could look for $1 billion for 5 years to make sure that this ecosystem has the resources that it needs. And then by October 2020, which is now, we basically got 50% of the fundraising done, which is pretty extraordinary if you think about the fact that it's money for advocacy, it's money for research, and it's money for a lot of on the ground work with citizens. So that was very, very positive that we got to 500 million last 2 weeks ago. So then the question is, how do you organize the space in the sense? I mean, the space has a lot of initiatives already. What is important about this way of thinking, and we are actually hoping to inspire other sectors to get organized in a way that allows them to go faster, then the point is that it's very, very, very easy, super easy to get misunderstood. So this campaign is a campaign to accelerate the electrification of road transportation in all segments. That means we have to be very good at understanding the levers of change across the system, right? Some will have to engage with the supply side, working with companies and making sure that they have targets. For example, Volvo said after 2030, we will not sell petrol and diesel cars. How do you do that? You work with the suppliers. Some of them work with them, some of them put pressure on them. You also have to work with the demand side, because somebody's gonna have to buy zero emission trucks, or somebody's gonna have to buy zero emission taxis. See, I'm not talking about necessarily passenger cars. I know that there is a whole conversation about car-free cities, biking more, walking more, which is beautiful and necessary. That being said, we still need to get food to the supermarkets. We still need to deliver goods. We still need to electrify fleets. So part of the initiative, for example, EV100, is already engaging 5 million fleet vehicles, and they are making sure they get electrified by 2030. Now, you can't just work with supply and demand and pretend that this is gonna take care of itself by market forces. We do need public policy, and that is one of the core foundations of Drive Electric. This will not happen unless you have proper policy in place, and that is what we have learned from Europe, that for the first time in the last 12 months became a market that went faster, for example, than China. I mean, the US is behind because they haven't had the policies. So we have learned a lot from China, from the US, from Europe, and some of the people in this coalition, that is all they do. Why do you think that the European Union in July of this year, the 14th of July, made the proposal as part of the climate package, Fit for 55, made the proposal to the 27 members to actually not sell any more petrol and diesel cars after 2035? Well, I'm happy to report that Transport and Environment and coalitions in Europe worked really hard to influence that decision in Brussels. It would not have happened without these organizations and coalitions and insiders, plus, you know, some other members that put pressure on certain business associations that were adamant not to have this goal. So my point to you is that what we have come to understand is that all these different levers of change that we have to press, we have to be very, very good at creating this kind of choreography that allows us to say, okay, this coalition is actually going to focus on cities because cities can go faster. I mean, I live in Amsterdam, and I can tell you that it is pretty clear by now that after 2030, not 2035, like Europe is proposing for national states, 2030, you will not see an internal combustion engine in Amsterdam. You will not even see a dirty boat on the channels because cities can go faster. Paris is going faster. In fact, you know, you have many stories, I'm sure you've heard them. At the same time, you also have to work with investors, and you have to work with coalitions of investors that are asking very tough questions to companies, like why are we investing? Why are we prolonging the life of the internal combustion engine if we know that is not the future? Why is it that that you are doing that? So investors can ask this question. I mean, investors can ask tough questions. And at the same time, the coalition has members, for example, that are quite critical of companies. I mean, some companies are great. They are really changing. They have had their, you know, their moment, especially after Dieselgate. Some companies are really understanding and really deeply trying to work it out with their workers, which is difficult. And yet, there are other companies that are really delaying this actively through business organizations, through lobbying, through making sure that people think this transition is too complicated and too difficult, and if you can't get right, and the infrastructure is a pain, and the electrification is a problem, and then they basically create a narrative that is, when you look at it, is about keep selling what they are selling. So my point is that one of the things that that I would like to encourage you to think about, regardless of whether you work on road transportation or agriculture or forestry, is how to make sure the ecosystem of actors, of, say, experts, activists, scientists, professors, like how do we make sure that we create very robust, a robust space so that we understand the role we have to play. The person putting pressure on companies will have to live with the fact that there will be others in the ecosystem that will work with companies to help them make the transition. Some of the people working on making sure that we have fewer cars in the city centers, that we bike more, that we walk more, that we are not so obsessed with car ownership. Those colleagues will have to understand that there will be other groups doing everything they can to increase the sales of electric cars for fleets. You know, so it's it's going to be difficult, but because we're humans and humans are difficult, we are difficult. We've seen this in so many spaces. Look at what happened with the masks, right? Like, we are complicated creatures. And at the same time, if we have to get this together, we have to accelerate this in the decade, we will have to be smarter about working with levers of change and understanding that, understanding what we do best and how to get the resources to do that. Now, I want to move us to the space of the Global South and to give you a flavor of what is going on in Latin America, because every single week, I kid you not, every single week I get an email from somebody, say somebody in Africa or in Latin America, my region, saying, oh, great, you are promoting electric cars in the north, and all that will happen. All that I know is that we will be the dumping place for the unwanted cars in Europe and in the US. Great, thank you so much. You know, so I initially when I got those emails, I would be like, why do people need to be so negative? I come from the South. I come from Central America. I know there is dumping. I drove to school in a bus that was like not even secondhand, with like third-hand from the US. Those old yellow buses that nobody wanted in the US ended up in Central America. And I know, I've been to Salvador, is terrible. Like, the imports of all cars in places in the South is a reality. So what do we do about that? And do we get in the mindset of only seeing the threats and not looking at the things we can proactively do? So is there anything I can tell you from Latin America that may surprise you? Well, I'd like to tell you that, for example, Costa Rica, a very small country, passed the first legislation promoting zero emission mobility in 2018. And, you know, contrary to wisdom that the North or the developed countries go faster and developing countries will have to go slower, well, we are more advanced on e-mobility than, say, your neighbor Australia, which is something that many people would have thought impossible 5 years ago. If I asked you, what developing country has already said is not going to sell any more petrol and diesel cars in their markets and is going to have the same year as Europe? Chile just decided this a few weeks ago. When you look at Colombia, contrary to what a lot of experts said, Colombia is electrifying buses, metropolitan buses, faster than some cities in Canada and the US. Chile, Santiago de Chile, has the largest electric bus fleet that is in a city in the Americas. Why do you think that is? Why is it that this completely surprised Volvo in Europe that thought, oh, there is no demand in the South, we're not going to sell electric buses in the South, and basically we'll just sell you cleaner diesel buses, which I always found pretty unacceptable, given that I know that Europe is going to go for zero emission. Well, it has 5 words. It's called China. Chinese companies that sell zero emission vehicles basically decided that Latin America was a good market. And then basically they went there and they started selling buses, they started selling trucks, they started selling cars for people or for fleets or for taxis. And meanwhile, you know, our friends in Europe and our friends in the US basically said, well, yeah, this is something we didn't see coming. So what is very interesting about what is happening in some emerging markets, not necessarily the poorest countries, unfortunately, because they have a lot of other problems, but the middle income bracket here, what I have discovered is that countries like Chile that do not have a big oil and gas company, especially not owned by the state, say, for example, in Brazil or Mexico, where you have Pemex or Petrobras, those countries have more agility. And if they don't produce the cars themselves, those countries also have more agility because precisely they don't have to deal with, some of the issues that you may face in a place like Argentina or Mexico, where, the whole our industrial strategies is still pretty anchored on the old models. So I think this is good news for smaller countries that can actually go faster. So a country like Costa Rica or a country like Chile, ironically, will go faster than a country like Mexico or Argentina, because basically they don't want to get stuck with the old technologies. And as I start looking at Africa next year, given that the COP will move from the UK to Africa, and it's very likely that Egypt will be the next host of the COP, you may be surprised, but Egypt, for example, is already deciding that they are not going to import secondhand cars. They won't. It's illegal. It's actually quite surprising when you look at specific countries. And once you start talking to some of the people working on the ground, you start to perceive that this idea that this transition is only for rich countries or is only for a certain type of city, you'd be surprised how much the numbers will tell you that if there is a benefit to this transition of getting rid of tailpipes, it's actually much bigger in the South, because the transportation system are so offensively polluting, and it's time to leapfrog. As opposed to get in the mindset of, all we need to do is to go incremental and basically go little by little. I think is the opposite. I think what we need to do, and this is something we're working on with Drive Electric, is to say, where are the top 10 countries in the South that can actually accelerate this and show to the others in their own regions there are so many benefits to not get stuck with the old technology. There are so many benefits of actually electrifying, because you will get the benefits as a company or as an operator. And I actually find that once you create the resources or a resource base for people working on the ground, one of the best things that we can do, and this is something that I'm working on, is connecting the activists from the North and the South, because ultimately the strategies are not going to be that different. So I'd like to stop. May I give you 30 seconds to, I gave you a lot of information, and I think what I'd like to do is, rather than give you more ideas of the specific things that we're doing in the context of Drive Electric or in the context of COP, perhaps this is a good time to start switching to questions that you may have, or things you don't agree with. It would be interesting. I'm happy to also have a conversation about things we could do better.
Okay, thank you very much, Monica. That was fascinating stuff. A great tour of the field. So yeah, we will switch to questions now. And Judy, I wondered, did you want to ask the first one? Or if you're not ready, I can go. Oh, and you're muted. You're still muted, Judy. Maybe I'll ask a question then. So one thing that interests me, and I think it's one of the questions that came up in the Q&A as well, is the work around the Drive Electric campaign is great, I think. But to my mind, there's a lot more to it than just electric cars, Now, I wondered if you would give some perspectives on other modes of other EVs, such as e-bikes, e-scooters, so on.
Yeah.
Just the whole idea of active transport. cycling and walking, and just what mix works and what has worked in different places that you've had experience of.
Yeah. So that's the core. That's a very important question, because if we think about the structural problem that we have with fossil fuels, we need to have clarity about what we need to, many things that we need to do this decade, but there are two that we need to do for sure, regardless of congestion. That's for now, first order things. This decade, we need to decarbonize electricity for sure, and we can. And we have to electrify transportation. And you don't need to wait until one is completed in order to do number two. There are enough studies that show that even if the electricity is not yet 100% renewable, you still have benefits from electrification. So that we need to keep that in mind, so that we put aside the notion that first we have to, that there is no benefit from electrification unless the electricity is 100%. By the way, it's 100% renewable in Costa Rica already, so it's great. It's not the case in India, it's not the case in China, it's not the case in places like Australia, okay? So that we need to be able to get everyone on board on the idea that from a climate perspective, that needs to happen. Now, at the same time, we have to recognize that there is this amazing movement, especially in big cities, but not only in big cities, but that is where a lot of the action is happening, to rethink our relationship with cars. That is happening. And with COVID, that there was an acceleration of, do we have to drive to work? Do we have to, do I even have to go to the office every day? And of course, in that context, this whole new spectrum of possibilities is becoming quite evident to us. I want to walk more. I want to bike. I want to take, but some people actually don't want to take the train in Amsterdam, for example, and they take bikes. So it's not like it's always, I take the bike and I don't want a car. Sometimes it's, I don't like buses, I want a bike, so it's more nuanced. Now, this is where it gets interesting. And this is what I have learned from living in Amsterdam. I actually think that the secret to this is to give people choices and make them choose. And that is where I think the conversation can get really, really passionate, because if, let's just say, if your starting point, the only thing you care about is how to get rid of cars, and that is the only thing you care about because that is who you are, and that's totally fine, then it can become so prescriptive that it then can become a problem, because you can start saying the only choice that is legitimate is to walk, take a bike, and take the bus. Don't you dare buy an electric car. If you go there, and I have dear friends going there, I find that ultimately will hurt our acceleration goals, because it will antagonize society. Let's look at what is going on around the world with masks. So my observation from Amsterdam is that the mayor managed to do something amazing. That woman managed to get Amsterdam to get rid of fossil cars by 2030, and there was no movement in the streets saying, trying to oppose it. And why is it? My argument is that it is because she was quite good at telling the story. What is the story she's telling to Amsterdammers? It's a zero emission zone. This is going to be a zero emission zone. It's going to go in phases. We're going to start in the city center, zero emission with public transportation and taxis. After a certain date, they won't be able to circulate if they are not zero emission. Then the zero emission area gets bigger, and it includes modes of transportation, and including boats, which is beautiful. You know, after 2023, I think the boats will have to be zero emissions. And then by 2030, the zone expands and everything will have to be zero emissions. And this is what I find politically smart. You know what she says? She says, if you want to bike, great. If you want to walk, great. If you want to take the bus, great. If you want to have a car, who am I to judge? It has to be zero emissions. It has to be electric. And I'll make sure as mayor, you will have the infrastructure. I will make sure that it's going to be good for investors to come to Amsterdam and deploy the infrastructure. So I find that we will need to tell something similar in other contexts so that we don't forget that at the end of the day, what we need is a zero emission vision for transportation. And we will have to make sure it's an opportunity for anybody who wants to be part of this without getting too prescriptive about, you know, bikes are morally good, cars are morally bad, because I personally find that unhelpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that raises some of the questions that are on the chat about, you know, whether a target at 2030 or 2050 is going to be enough, and what proportion of the transport is going to be zero carbon and so forth. And I think what I'm hearing from you is that you open up the choices, but mainly through scale. And this is an issue for New Zealand particularly, that we have a small population, very dispersed. We don't have dense cities, although that we're going that way rather quickly, we think, which do open up some opportunities. But this question of scale, and also the culture in Amsterdam, is that you ride a bike, whereas that's not the culture here. Although I grew up in that culture, I rode a bike most of my childhood and student days. But the question is that people are interested to know is what proportion of reaching zero carbon from transport do you think will come from electric cars? Do we hear you saying that there's going to be a mix, and the mix is what gives people choice and therefore motivation to make change?
Yeah, so it's obviously, you know, every country will have a different profile. So we just have to, you know, realize, obviously New Zealand and Costa Rica might be similar, but maybe Japan and say South Africa. So we you know, that is a caveat. That being said, there are some very good numbers out there. So for example, in the context of the campaign, we know that if we accelerate 20 years, the electrification of all segments, think about buses, trucks, taxis, fleets, you know, if we make this happen faster, we're talking about 160 gigatons, which is not insignificant. So there are concrete benefits from a climate perspective. Now, what is the proportion when it comes to, for example, active mobility versus decarbonization of all these segments, you know, electrification? If you look at the ICCT, the International Council for Clean Transportation, I think I said it wrong, ICCT, so International Council for Clean Transportation, I said it right. They, for example, look at how much we can achieve by 2050, you know, in the next 30 years. And what they say is, you know, if you look at the kilometers out there, commercial kilometers versus personal kilometers, the bulk of the problem is not necessarily the personal kilometers, you know, that you will use to go to a supermarket. It's basically 75% will get from electrification, from actually changing those technologies, and around 15% you'll get by, you know, instead of going to the supermarket, you take the bike, or instead of, you know, yeah. So the point is, even if we get very, very, very good with active mobility, which we should, we some studies say you can get to 30% under the most optimistic scenario, but it's still 30%. The 70% we're going to have to deal with heavy trucking, freight, buses, and just so that we don't perhaps because there is Tesla and because there is this kind of idea that electric cars are objects of desire and very expensive, and to some degree, and for a certain public, that is the only way. For people who may have a prejudice or may, we also have to think about the fact that trucking is particularly offensive. Trucking and diesel trucks are killing people. If you look at, for example, low-income communities in the US, not even in Latin America, in the US, some of them get out sometimes 60 trucks in 1 hour. So some of the campaigns to get to zero emission trucking in California came as a result of, frontline communities saying we've had enough. This is not acceptable. So my point is that when I say drive electric campaign, even though the first thing that will come is a car, let's just take a step back and think, is both an e-bike or a truck? We're going to have to, perhaps the best thing we can do with the campaign is to have better visuals so that people get a sense of the whole spectrum.
Yes. Thanks, Monica. I'd just like to switch topic a little bit. One of the things you raised in your talk was about the global south and the adoption of new technology and importation of used vehicles and so on. And the question is really around equality or inequality between countries. And so if new technologies are more expensive, and let's say a developing country is not going to import the old technology, let's say, of second-hand vehicles, then aren't we just increasing inequality if we're sort of bringing in the new technology into a country that can afford it less well than a developed country? I suppose this comes back to global climate finance and so on, and what's in the Paris Agreement around that. But have you got any comments on how that kind of thing's handled?
Sure, and it is a very unequal world, and I come from one of the worst offenders. Latin America is deeply unequal. So that has to be part of the conversation, and there is another level of complexity. We can talk about it on a different day. Is informal transportation, right? Like all these, shuttles and vans that operate outside the system and are deeply polluting. And I can tell you, I'm part of a partnership that is looking at that. That is a very important segment. And interestingly enough, there are experts on that want to understand how to eventually have, for example, electric options for informal transportation in the South, which when I heard that, I was like, wow, there are some amazing people out there thinking completely thinking in a very strategic way. But let's go back to the formal markets. There are several things that we should keep in mind. One is that by 2026, so that's why the next 5 years are so important, and that's why we have to go faster. It is expected that the price of an old, let's call old technology car with petrol and diesel, a tailpipe, not necessarily the future, that technology and the new technology are expected to reach price parity, because what makes this technology expensive is the price of the battery, and that is getting cheaper by the year. So that is very good news, and we already know that this may happen faster for buses, and this is excellent news. For example, think of fleet owners in the South. It's usually companies, and these companies can totally afford to buy these models. So there is going to be that in the South, because an operator of a fleet in Colombia or in Chile will save money. So we, prices are not static, And that is good news, because it's not like the technology will be more expensive forever. Number two, when you look at something we call the total cost of ownership, TOC, that is the key. It's not just the price of something, it's the operation of something. So why is it that Chile, when you talk to Metrobus, why is it that they love their electric buses? Because even though when they bought them, they had to pay more, the operation of that bus is actually, in the case of Chile, at some point, it was like 60% cheaper. So the point is, you actually can afford to do that, because operating the new version of this technology is cheaper than operating the one where you have to bring the gasoline or the diesel, and you have all these internal combustion engine pieces, and you have to, the maintenance of this thing that we call the internal combustion engine is terrible. So, and the final point is, developing countries, I mean, there is inequality for sure, but there is a lot of resources in the South. There is so much money in Africa and Latin America and Asia. It's poorly distributed, that's for sure. But the amount of capital and the amount of money and investments that is there, it would be ironic if the capital and the money in the South is locking in the old technology. So I actually would turn it around, and I would say that it is in emerging markets where we have to do everything we can to make sure that the local markets accelerate this, because it will increase their quality of the cities, and it will increase the livelihood of a lot of people. It will be better for the country, so they would benefit the country if they clean it up through, at least in road transportation.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Monica, we're going to have to go to the last question, and we've still got quite a few questions here. But since you've concentrated your comments on the big bulk of the emissions in the transport sector, and particularly about movement of goods and trucks and so on, and you haven't mentioned about mode shift, which might be something you could just comment on briefly, but there is a view abroad that electric trucks are not going to come to New Zealand, and that hydrogen has an advantage in New Zealand, and because of transition from oil out and using similar infrastructure and so on. In other words, sort of easing the transition. And we're just interested to know what your thinking is about that, because I'm aware that there are large advances in electric trucks in Europe, and the question is, how do we get them here?
Sure. This is thank you so much, because this is a very important, I mean, hydrogen is a very important topic. First of all, let's just say green hydrogen whenever we can, because most hydrogen is produced with natural gas, and that is a problem, because there is in Europe there is a risk, which is that gas infrastructure companies will try to lock in gas infrastructure through arguments around hydrogen, and that is a problem, and it's a very heated debate here in Europe, because it will expand the life of certain gas assets, and that is incompatible with the Paris Agreement. So whenever we can, we should emphasize that we're gonna need hydrogen for hard to abate sectors such as steel, and we have to make sure it's green. And what triggered this whole debate around hydrogen in Europe was that because there was a green package after COVID, there were so many funds to boost the economy. And when you put so many funds, it activates a lot of competing visions for how to get to zero. So that's important, because one narrative around hydrogen comes from hydrogen people, and when it comes to heavy trucking, we have to also listen what the heavy trucking companies are saying. And they are not saying that this has been settled for hydrogen. What they are saying is we are doing pilot projects. For example, Daimler is partnering with Volvo to do some experiments with hydrogen. It's great. At the same time, when you look at, for example, Britain or all Europe that are already producing heavy trucks, they are electrifying. So it's not necessarily true that we have to write off battery electric for trucking, and that we are only going to solve this by waiting for the economics of hydrogen in trucking to work out, because this is still quite expensive. I think for the purpose of New Zealand, I find that Colombia is already doing something you could try, which is, why is it that you have zero emission trucks in Colombia? Well, because somebody from the financial sector found a way of creating this leasing program. So the actual owners of the assets are the investors, and they, through some, basic mechanism, they do the leasing to, say, a beer company that is delivering the beer, bread company that is delivering all this bread around Colombia. And my point is, if you find a way of financing this through leasing or another mechanism, I actually think that the demand will start showing to the suppliers that they have to start selling in those markets, because that is at least how we got some car companies to pay attention to Latin America.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Monica. I'm sorry, just for those of you who are still waiting, we just ran over, and apologies we didn't get to everyone's questions, but thank you so much, Monica, for taking the time to join us today. It's been a huge privilege to hear from you and learn more about your experiences, and thank you so much to James and Judy for taking us through this session today. We hope that the rest of you enjoy your day or evening, depending on where you are, and I'm just going to hand over to Sandra now to close the session for us with a karakia.
Ka whakairia te tapu, kia watea ai te ara, kia tūru ki whakataha ai, kia tūru ki whakataha ai, hui e tai ki e. Restrictions are moved aside, so the pathway is now clear to return to everyday activities, enrich and unify. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you, everyone.